I am Jim Collison and live from the Gallup campus here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Called the Coach, recorded on May 8th, 2019. Called the Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you have questions during this webcast, we do have a chat room. It's available for you. There's a link below the main video window on our live page. Select that. The chat will be on the right or below. There's three little buttons there. Click that. It'll pop it out. Love to have you in there. The default is top chat in the upper left-hand corner. Just change that to live chat. And I just can't say chat enough in that sense. If you're listening to the recorded version or have questions about custom strengths coaching solutions, we do that as well. Send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. And don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com for all your Clifton strengths coaching resources and training needs. You can also catch the video on both streaming and downloadable audio. We call that podcasting. All the cool kids are doing it. If you're not, it's the greatest way to recapture that time in a train, on a plane, in a car. Those kinds of places where you normally just be listening. All the links to do that is on our coach's blog, coaching.gallup.com. Mike McDonald is our host today. Mike's a senior workplace consultant here at Gallup. And Mike, always great to have you back, especially for this series. Welcome back to Called the Coach.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I love this series, and particularly the topic and the guest that we have with us today. We put this out there. We know that we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's such a profound priority, right? I think there's so many well-intended efforts, and I'm thrilled that we have Ella Washington with us. Ella is a subject matter expert, diversity and inclusion subject matter expert for Gallup, and I'm really thankful that she's here in a variety of ways. Jim, you mentioned already, just selfishly and preferentially, you getting to learn from her, likewise for myself, but I think if we were all to be really honest when it comes to this topic, I think there are so many well-intended efforts that just don't hit the mark, right? I think so I'd like to close that gap. And this is what Ella, this is what you represent so well, is how do we connect the effort with the outcome in true understanding? And I think there's a unique space. I don't think there is, I know there is a unique space, honestly, for all of us as coaches, and everything that we know about strengths as a primary contribution that can really help those efforts, all of the intentions really come together to really arrive at the right outcomes of understanding and performance. So I'm pretty excited about this, I'll be honest. It's funny, sometimes I actually will get asked to speak about diversity and inclusion, which as you all are, if you're watching the screen, is incredibly ironic. I may represent the exact opposite of diversity and inclusion in terms of the stereotype and the framework of it. But the essence of it is I know where the world is going. And fortunately for all of us, as it's evolving, I probably better study up on it and be an expert, because I think I'm probably going to have to figure out how I operate and represent my own particular sphere of the world in a unique contribution. But anyway, all to be said is, Ella, I'm really glad you're here, and I couldn't be more excited for what you'll share with us as we get started.
Well, thank you, Mike and Jim, for having me. I'm so happy to be here and know that we'll have a great conversation. And even starting with the point you just made, everyone is not only entitled, but needed to be a part of the diversity and inclusion conversation. And so your views, as well as everyone's views, are really important for this conversation, and to not only move the needle forward, but to really maximize the changes that we need to see, not only in our organizations, but our communities and the world at large.
Right. Well, the statement couldn't be more powerful, and the need is there for all the right reasons. So let's put you to work, Ella. You know so much, and you've studied so much. We're featuring your paper on diversity and inclusion specifically today. And group, just as you know, we've been following a 4 data point outline. Here are those 4 data points as we queue up our conversation. The 4 numbers are, drum roll please, Jim, we need sound effects as we reveal these, 55, 44.2, 46, and 51. So I'll go back through those one more time. That's 55, 44.2, 46, and 51. Those are our data point outlines as we walk through our conversation today. Before we get right to the data, though, Ella, maybe I'm projecting. I don't think I am based on the clients that I've worked with. I think we're a little bit loose with our language about exactly what we're speaking to when we say diversity, when we say inclusion. I think sometimes we're guilty of interchanging those numbers or those reference points. Can you clean up for us the definition of both of those things and primarily how they really are different from each other, so we have a real clarity around the terminology?
Yeah, certainly. So we would define diversity as any difference between individuals and groups. So just to simplify it again, any difference between individuals and groups. Now, traditionally, diversity conversations have focused on demographic differences such as, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, or physical disability. Those would be the topics that are usually entering into the diversity conversation. And though those demographic characteristics are very important and generally most salient to a person's identity, Gallup agrees with the trend that is happening now as our workplace and world is changing to adopt a little bit of a broader definition of diversity that includes lifestyles, personalities, opinions, family composition, education level, tenure, and other elements of diversity that kind of represent that underlying definition of any difference between individuals and groups. So sometimes it can be a little bit challenging to think about, everything can be diversity, but it really can be. And so it depends on the context of the conversation. And that's certainly not to belittle, again, the saliency of those demographic characteristics, the ones that you can usually see or kind of pick up on, or the ones that are most salient to our identity. So it's really having a balance between those things in these conversations.
Right.
As we think about inclusion, we define that as a culture that values the unique perspectives and contributions of everyone. So, an organization, it'd be of all employees, but it could be of everyone in a community or other type of atmosphere. We would assess inclusion by the extent to which people are valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate in the organization. So I'll say that again. It's the extent to which employees, for example, in organizations, are valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate within their organization. Now, a few points on what diversity is not and what inclusion is not. Diversity itself does not guarantee inclusion. And so it's important to parse out the differences between diversity and inclusion. Although they are often paired together and they certainly are complementary, one does not automatically beget the other. Again, diversity does not only refer to race and gender, as I went through. There are many other aspects of diversity that can be understood and applied. Diversity also doesn't require organizations to lower the bar for diverse groups. And so a truly diverse and inclusive environment is one that is valuing everyone's contributions and kind of raising the bar for everyone, not lowering the bar as some people might assume. And then finally, diversity is not just the responsibility of an HR department or even kind of the CEO of an organization. It's a topic that is important from both a top-down and bottom-up perspective. We need our local teams and local managers to take inclusion as seriously as we expect from our leadership. And I'll just add a few more points around what inclusion is not. So inclusion doesn't automatically happen just because you have a diverse workforce. It also doesn't come only if you have, strong leadership that is promoting diversity, but no kind of buy-in from the rest of the organizations. As I mentioned, local teams do play an equal role in promoting inclusion. And then finally, inclusion doesn't get solved through training alone. So training is wonderful. We do a lot of it here at Gallup, and I certainly enjoy it. But a systematic strategy is also required for truly inclusive cultures, one that goes beyond just, training.
No, I love that. There's 3 words that I wrote down that just jumped right out when you were talking about those, Ella. The first one is I think we all get excited when we think about identity, right? And it's such a contribution that strengths brings to the table, but even beyond strengths, right? That we talk about being unique, but there are infinite possibilities for how unique we are. And if we understand that, right, then there's an ownership and a claim that we have to have around that. And I love, so identity was the first, and it's the right identity. It's an accurate one. Ownership was the second reference point that came out, that it's okay for the best of diversity, the best of inclusion to be generated by ourselves, right? If we understand it well, we can actually step into the benefits and the contributions it can make, as well as call those out for each other. And I think that's kind of the third word that I wrote down then was we move away from those unproductive assumptions. Those generalizations that for the speed and sake of just efficiency and nothing else are just easy for us to just categorize people. So quite frankly, we can move past them more quickly, right? Without really extracting any value or any of the identity features from what they might bring to bear. So yeah, some real call outs there. And so I love the definitions, and I'd like to get into the landscape then. Our first data point then is 55. And that 55 represents 55% in Ella's study of that population who strongly agree that their organization has policies that promote diversity and inclusion. So Ella, just as with every data point, what does 55% mean? In your own estimation, is that good? Is that bad? Does that show growth? What's the context around 55% that provides opportunity?
Certainly. So 55% is certainly progress if we look at the last 20, 25 years. But certainly there's still a lot of work to be done. In today's changing workforce that you mentioned earlier, not only is diversity and inclusion the right thing to do morally and ethically, but it's also smart for businesses. And I know we'll talk about some of those kind of smart business outcomes in a little bit later. But when we think about the 55%, that would agree that their organization has policies to promote diversity and inclusion. The reality is that not every company has committed to policies to promote D&I. It's kind of an assumption that we have these days, but not every organization is there yet. Many organizations are on the continuum between compliance that we saw, 20 to 30 years ago, where many organizations started their D&I journeys, to awareness, which is kind of the next level up, and really understanding, okay, what are our D&I challenges? How can we be more aware of them? What training can we implement, to true inclusion? So it's this long kind of continuum, and every organization is somewhere on that continuum. There's no kind of endpoint. It's kind of an endless journey, a journey that will continue to be iterated as D&I changes, as our workforce changes. So, if your organization is still in the compliance or awareness space, it's not something to panic about, but it is the reality that every organization is somewhere on that continuum.
Right.
Now, for example, many companies have not yet gone beyond basic recruiting policies around D&I. And so kind of getting beyond that level of D&I means recruitment policies is where you start to push more into the awareness, push more into the inclusion perspective. Now, for those many companies that do have diversity and inclusion efforts, that 55% statistic probably represents a lack of awareness of what the company is doing. So we talked a bit about, the need for D&I to be both bottom up and top down. Many organizations need more concerted efforts to let people know what their company is doing around D&I and how it impacts their daily jobs and the overall culture of the company. And so if you're relying on HR and you just think diversity and inclusion is, it sits in the human resource department, and the leadership is not making sure that employees are tuned into not only what is being done around D&I, but how that impacts their daily jobs, then there's a missed opportunity there. And I think that 55% is represented there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important piece is the compliance is the ticket of admission, right? But the expectation should very quickly happen on the other side. That's where I'll be honest, that's where I get a little bit obstinate or stubborn, I guess, where I think we have an opportunity to move success past just not breaking the law, and to get into true outcomes and potential on the other side. And I think sometimes, and no judgment, but I think sometimes we feel like we cross that finish line of not breaking the law, we exhale, and then we just assume that that's a job well done. And I love the fact that you're creating a gap that still has yet to be filled with so much opportunity. And again, that's a space where we can ourselves offer our coaching, the placement of strengths, all to create that, to bridge that performance versus the expectation. So no, let's jump into that gap then. So we have 55%, and let me back up on this. So I do want to ask you, so Ella, 55% strongly agree that their company has policies, right? Just that they actually have something formalized. But what's your opinion or your reaction to what's an effective policy? What's a check off the box policy. Do you have any insight or reaction to the value of not all policies are created equal and the effect they have?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's one thing to have kind of a rule in place that when a check the box is needed, you're able to implement. So, for example, a recruiting policy or a policy around how we should treat each other in the workplace, right? But what really matters is how that shakes out. In line with the company culture. And so in organizations, there are many times these underlying parts of our culture. And so the things that we say we do, and then there are the things that we actually really do, right? So if we have a policy around everyone should be promoted equally in the organization, but that doesn't connect to how we are actually manifesting those promotions and having those backdoor conversations, then there's a gap. And so the policy can be written well, but it really has to come to life through the spirit of how work really gets done and how decisions really get made within companies.
Boy, that's fantastic. Like that's the layer that I love that additional layer there that's going to support and make it a true statement of value in the way it's operationalized and executed. We can follow the rules and still be terrible people to each other in between the
Certainly.
spaces, right? So I love that connection point. So the world is changing. 55% have policies, but the second data point is going to increasingly give organizations who want to succeed less choice about whether they have policies at all or about the effectiveness of the policies they do put into motion. Coaches, our second data point is 44.2% of millennials are non-white. And that's only going to increase with Gen Z. So what the reality of diversity and inclusion and the way it's introducing itself and bringing itself into the workplace is a force that we will have to look very squarely in the eye and integrate in effectively or struggle with. And the fact that if 44% of that group is non-white and 70% of the workforce is going to be millennial next year, it's now, right? We're probably behind the game if we haven't started that journey already. So what are the features of and the pressures and the opportunities within the 70% millennial workforce coming in who represents a very different face, personality, profile than what the traditional workforce has been built on?
Yeah, great question. What's so fascinating about that statistic when it came out about 5 years ago, it seemed like a really long ways away, right? Now we're looking at 2020 just next year. And so it's like,
Yeah.
if you, like you said, if you haven't started thinking about this, the time is certainly now. You're behind the ball even. But that 70% of the workforce being millennial really means that globally, millennials will occupy not only the majority of individual contributor positions, but the majority of leadership roles as well. It doesn't stop just at that individual contributor place. And so millennials will be responsible for making very important decisions that affect workplace cultures and the lives of people everywhere. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, we know that millennials define diversity and inclusion much more broadly than previous generations, who mainly focused on those demographic differences such as race and gender, right, and other visible demographics. But now millennials are thinking beyond those demographics and thinking about backgrounds and experiences and perspectives, which introduces a whole nother layer of diversity. And so in that, managers have to find new ways to bridge the gap of all the generations in the workplace. In many organizations, there's 4 and even 5 generations in the workplace. And that will continue to be exacerbated over the next few years. So a few things that managers should be thinking about are, millennials are such a connected generation. So how do you leverage that level of connection to build more inclusive teams? Are there ways that you can think beyond kind of the traditional mechanisms of team communication and connection, and to leverage that ability to make everyone on the team feel more inclusive, particularly as we think about remote workers or even remote workers with non-traditional schedules? Secondly, what we know about millennials is that there is now an expectation to have inclusive conversations. I think, our technology platforms, our social media platforms, they have allowed people to be much more vocal about their opinions on different issues. And managers now have to be equipped with the tools to have conversations around diversity and inclusion, to talk about some of those challenging things that we might see in the news that's happening outside of our workplaces. It's no longer longer okay for managers to skirt the issues and not feel comfortable talking about these conversations anymore, because this new generation of the workforce are going to expect not only to have the conversation, but they're going to look to their managers and leaders to demonstrate some knowledge and care around those topics.
Yeah. So let's be more direct about. I'd love your reaction, Ella, as we bring strengths then directly into the conversation. Obviously, this audience knows strengths infinitely well. World's leading experts who are tuning in and listening to Jim's podcast, and we know the value and the impact of strengths. But where an application is the contribution of strengths then in the ease and the opportunity of the potential of those types of conversations that approximate a culture to actually happen. I don't want to get too far into it. I'd love your reaction, but what's real advice around that? What is the potential of that if effectively deployed?
Yeah, so a few things that come to mind there. Humans all have this competing need to be both belonging and to be both unique on teams, right? And so we all want to feel like we are, great and we're wonderful and we're contributing to our teams in these fantastic ways and we can't be replaced. But we also want to feel a part of the larger group. We don't want to stand out in a way that we don't feel accepted. Now, the beautiful thing about strengths, as we know, is that it really meets both of those human needs that we have for inclusion, both the uniqueness and the belongingness need. Strengths allows us to demonstrate our uniqueness. We all know the statistics about, everyone not having the same 5 and the 1 in 33 million people having the same strengths. And I think 1 in 278,000 or something like that, having them in the same order. So it is a value of uniqueness. I am so unique when I think about my top 5 strengths, right? And so it meets that need. But also it helps our team to have a more integrated conversation, a safe space for us to talk about differences in a way that feels celebrated instead of in a way that feels negative. And so that meets that belonging need. And so when you think about those two competing needs that strengths is able to speak to both, at the same time, it's a platform for managers to really leverage that and to think about, okay, does this conversation require an elevation of the belongingness that strengths can provide in this conversation around this, conversation that has concepts that everyone on the team can kind of understand and lean into? Or does this conversation around strengths allow me to highlight how wonderful and unique this person on my team is, and how we're just so happy that we have their skills and their strengths as a larger part of our team and our organization.
Yeah, I love that. What's coming to mind right now as you wordsmith this is, to me, it's we move you can feel the cultural shift in your description from moving from a zero-sum scenario of competition, right? So if Ella has these things, that means that I can't have those things. And now all of a sudden it moves from competition to collaboration. It's a shift now where it's like, oh, wow, Ella has these things and I have these things. I have my things, right? And so now the contribution, right? The mutual contribution towards each other's success changes. Otherwise, we're restrained by the assumptions. We're restrained by the stereotypes. And I think that zero sum versus abundance mentality comes along with the right diversity and inclusion outcomes. So we can create that on purpose. I love that.
And I would add that it creates a space where difference is not bad.
Right.
And for humans, we automatically assume difference is bad because we're drawn to things that are like us. And that's just a natural human tendency. But with strengths, we start to celebrate that difference is great. We need difference on this team so that we can perform at our best, right? And how can we not only understand and appreciate, but leverage and maximize our team differences?
Right. I love it. I get a little bit, again, obstinate sometimes, but, what we say and what we do has a gap around diversity and inclusion. And so we say that differences are advantages, but our actions don't always align with that. And it's a lot of times I'll look at that statement like, gosh, we read a lot of Hallmark cards that say, differences are advantages, or some of these, motivational posters that hang up on the walls that say that. And I'm like, I don't know. Are they? I think they can be, but I'm not sure if left to our own design that we always authenticate that statement, that we actually live up to the fact like, oh yeah, differences really are advantages. Because I think we've seen the reverse of that be just as true, if not more so, without the structure you're giving us. And I think the opportunity for strengths to really jump into that space. So I love the fact that we're held accountable to that statement should be true. We can choose to make it true. And this gives us a great opportunity. So coming into our third data point, then Ella, as we think now, sharpening the tip of the spear around the outcomes, so to speak. Now, what does this actually mean if we do this right? And so our third data point is 46%, and the reference there is that the combination of engagement and just gender diversity, just that one demographic cut, gender diversity resulted in your study, Ella, 46% gain in performance. So the combination of engagement plus gender diversity in that study resulted in a 46% higher gain in performance. So Ella, give us the context of the study. What was the discovery beyond just the mix of genders and engagement that explains higher performance?
Absolutely. So, in the last few years, Gallup studied more than 800 business units from two specific companies representing two different industries. So, those industries were both retail and hospitality. And kind of the overarching point that we found is that gender difference business units had better financial outcomes than those dominated by just one gender. Um, so, a few reasons that we know that this happens is because both men and women have different viewpoints, ideas, and market insights, which enables better problem solving, ultimately relating to better superior performance at the business unit level. And that's exactly what we found in these two organizations. Secondly, a gender diverse workforce allows the companies to serve an increasingly diverse customer base. And so we often know our clients are asking for, teams that reflect the diversity within their organizations, within their communities. And so having the gender diverse workforce allows that company to serve that customer base. And the third point that we learned from this study is that gender diversity helps company not only attract, but also retain talented women. And so as more women join the labor force around the world, companies can't afford to ignore that 50% of the potential workforce and expect to also be competitive in the global economy. So to really compete, to really outperform the competition, companies have to mirror, again, the larger world population, and specifically with gender, that's about 50% of the potential workforce.
That's terrific. The points are unreal there. Jim, I wanted to kind of bring you into this conversation. You were just bringing up some points before we got on the call about how many solutions we have to the gap in technology needs, right, in the workspace, and how much of a solution, right, diversity and inclusion is when we think about non-white populations coming in, as well as the women in the workplace. We had Heather Wright on a couple of weeks ago speaking to the solutions and the opportunities we have to provide greater access and opportunity with all populations, that the gap exists, unfortunately and unnecessarily. So as you recruit and you think strategically and futuristically, you have specific reference points about how those solutions make sense in our world. What have you, recite for us again what your observations were? I think that's a valuable contribution.
Let's say in the city of Omaha, we're short about 2,000 software developers every single year. And yet in our college and university systems, we're seeing 7% women and then fill in, 93% men in computer science or engineering related degrees where we would pull those students from. And the diversity numbers are even less. We see around a 3% in local colleges and universities in that specific area of skill set. And so if we would change the equation a little bit, if we would get and not limit the number of men, but grow the number of women. Right. So that number would grow to 50%, not from attrition of one in an addition to the other, but by just a sheer addition to the other, which we know those skills are out there and they can be done. Yeah. That alone would fix the problem in a lot of ways. Also knowing though that in the areas of diversity, we could, with it just being 3%, if we could move that number just a smidge, I mean, maybe 15, 20%, we would be over the top on that. And so when you start thinking of it that way, Ella, we have, when we talk about these, we have a lot of challenges beyond just not being able to hire them, but there are some cultural challenges when we think about transportation or opportunity. I mentioned to you, ACT prep is one of those things that some students get access to and other students don't. Those have long tail effects when we think about, okay, if they're not scoring high enough on the ACT, the money is not there for them to go to college. The opportunities aren't happening. They're not filling those roles. It gets pretty complicated when we think about that. And Ella, anything you want to add in? Those are just some raw numbers from here, from the Omaha Metro, but Anything you want to add in on that?
So I think the study that we were talking about provides a good example of that, because we did find that gender diversity and engagement, for example, vary substantially across business units, even within a company, right? And so that in turn affects the business performance of these business units. And so what we know is that a blanket policy for organizations or for communities or for universities designed to increase overall gender diversity or any other type of diversity, for example, is unlikely to achieve the desired results or increase performance. And so, as we looked at one slice of the diversity pie as far as gender diversity and engagement, we saw those specific differences, but one policy wouldn't have kind of leveled out gender diversity in these organizations that we were studying. And so certainly as we're thinking about larger policies around diversity and inclusion, one blanket policy isn't going to change those numbers in the university. One blanket policy isn't going to really move the needle for D&I in companies. And so it's something that we have to keep top of mind.
Yeah, it's a great story.
I do, Ella, hold on before we move on. I do appreciate that, because sometimes even in the corporate world, we kind of think, well, let's just come up with a policy, or let's just do one thing. Here in the city of Omaha, being part of the ecosystem, we have a STEM ecosystem group that I'm a part of. And the tendency is, let's make this simple. If we can just change one thing. And the thing I'm learning is it takes hundreds of little actions to actually make a difference. We have to have these little things happening all around the city or all around the nation or whatever. And we can't get trapped into thinking if we just come up with one way of doing this, it'll solve all our problems. If we could just do this. Well, that works maybe in Avengers, but not when we think about the workforce, and we think about in this particular case, the diversity problem that we have in getting it. There's so many ways we have to attack this, and so many of the little nooks and crannies we have to get after. It's going to take everybody getting involved to do this. This can't be this. You said this earlier, Ella. This can't be an HR thing, because it's everybody, right? This can't be a corporate thing, because it's also the education system. It's also what's going on in the nonprofit space. It's also what's going on in the faith space. Like, all those groups need to come together to get this done. And it takes, to use the George Bush analogy, it's going to take 1,000 points of light to be able to get this done. I think that's what he meant back in that day.
You're right. I think you're right. Well, I love that conversation, because to me, consistent with coaching, consistent with strengths, consistent with engagement, and what you're helping us understand, Ella, and Jim, your case study is perfect. All of these solutions are within our direct span of influence and control. Sometimes I think, diversity and inclusion has a parallel experience or approach as engagement does, where it's like, it's so broad and it's so big. How could we ever get our arms around it and get it to a level where we can do something about it? And I appreciate your research and the pressure points you identify for us, Ella, because it gets us to where it is local and actionable and even individual. And Jim, I think that was ultimately even the point that you brought around. We all have a role to play, and ultimately we can own our own influence and effect on diversity and inclusion.
Mike, can I jump in with a quick question from the chat room on this? So Jess asked this great question. How to work with diversity and inclusion across multiple generations, because millennials see diversity and inclusion differently than baby boomers, for example. How do you work that so both participate? Ella, any thoughts on that? Is it that much different for the baby boomers, and why did the Gen Xers get left out in that sense? That's what I want to know. Are you keep going.
Well, what's interesting, when we did our millennial study in 2016, we found that there are a lot of similarities in the way that millennials think at this cross section of their life as previous generations did when they were in their 20s and early 30s, right? And so we're all people, right? And so we have different kind of experiences. Technology has played a big role in that. But many of the life changes and evolutions that happen to other previous generations. And it's kind of our job to see the commonalities across generations, and also being focused on the kind of mission and purpose. Why are we all here, right? And so we know that having that superordinate goal on any team will help drive higher performance, but also will help drive more synergy between team members. And so as much as we can highlight and celebrate the differences between our generations, we should also spend as much time highlighting the ways that we're the same and the ways that we have connection, and especially again around the mission and purpose of not only your team but your organization. And so those are a few tactical ways that you can start to bridge that gap. And it's not an either or conversation, it's a both and conversation. And so we are different and we are similar in these ways. And I think start to having those conversations and starting to have teams see each other as individuals, and that should be celebrated in all those individual ways, but also part of the larger microcosm of the organization is going to be helpful.
Awesome. Jim, anything else from the chat room? Any other questions? Okay.
Go ahead, Mike. Let me weed through some of these and let's roll on.
Yeah, I love it. Well, playing off that parallel, then we talked about the relationship or the comparisons between engagement and diversity and inclusion. And I'd love to get into, Ellie, you have some insights around that formal relationship in our research. And the last data point that we reference in our outline is 51% of engaged employees perceive their organization to be perfectly inclusive. So think about the intensity of that language, right? 51% of engaged employees perceive their organization to be perfectly inclusive. When we look at our not engaged and our actively disengaged, it's almost zero who consider their organization to be perfectly inclusive. So obviously there's a relationship there. I think if we would look at the order of the statement is, I'm going to ask you, Ella, engagement a predictor of diversity and inclusion? Does it contribute more to the relationship than diversity and inclusion contributes to engagement? Or what's that relationship and contribution look like with the two of those together? And why does it matter? What's the story behind that?
Yeah, certainly. So employee engagement and inclusion are very closely related. We know that engagement is the building block for a larger inclusive culture. And so that's how we would think about it. Engagement is one of those necessary elements for an inclusive culture. But our data does talk about how the relationship kind of goes both ways between inclusion and engagement. We at Gallup have found that engaged employees are more likely to strongly agree that their company values diverse opinions and ideas, right? And so that's one of a key tenet of an inclusive culture. When we look specifically at our engagement clients and those clients that have taken our Q12 assessment, there's two questions that specifically stand out among the rest. And that's question 5, cares about me, and question 7, my opinions count. And so these questions often provide really specific insight on the inclusion of a workplace culture. And so those are kind of the areas we start to look at. Organizations that score high on both Q5 and Q7 are usually found to be more inclusive overall. And so they have higher correlations with inclusive measures. But it's also important to look at the demographic differences for employees on employee engagement scores on these individual items or like items. If you're using an assessment outside of Q12, how can you start to understand the demographic differences as a good starting place on engagement items? And what is that telling us? But we have to also remember that inclusion and engagement are not the same. It's really possible to have a highly engaged work culture that lacks important elements of both diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
So, for example, we know that 70% of engagement is influenced by the local level of the organization, local level managers, but a culture of inclusion relies on both top-down and bottom-up influence of leaders, teams, and managers. And so that's one area that can be missing. Another element of it is that when you have organizations with a lot of individual contributors, right? And so I could be someone who really enjoys my job. I get excited about coming to work every day, and I could even have a positive relationship with my direct manager. But when I go to the cafeteria or when I go to sit with the larger team, I don't quite feel as included. I don't feel like I belong. There's not this larger sense of belonging. So I have that high uniqueness that we talked about earlier, but I don't have that high sense of belonging. And so there are critical elements that go beyond engagement that are important for a truly inclusive environment. However, understanding the engagement of your workforce and particular levels such as cares about me or opinions count is a really good start. And we often see high correlations between being highly engaged and having high inclusion.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We haven't fully arrived. If we think we figured out engagement, there's still more, right? A lot more to add to our culture. I love the way that brings it to a wrap then, because ultimately, right, it helps us think about the language that cross connects those engagement attributes and features, the language of strengths and what it promotes. But we have this language now that promotes and exhibits the best of expectations and delivery around diversity and the conversion to inclusion, right, as it aims towards performance. Ella, as we bring this on home, I'd just love to give the floor back to you. Your best, most practical advice for what we as coaches, with all we know about strengths, what's the best contribution we can make to the biggest contribution or outcome when we think about strengths targeted towards the best of diversity and inclusion?
So I'd say two things. As we think about leveraging strengths, it's certainly considered a tool for inclusion. It's not the only tool, but it's a really powerful one that, again, both celebrates the uniqueness of your clients, but also their need to belong on their teams and in their larger communities. And as you're building your client relationship, I'd say don't be afraid to ask about background experiences and other things that contribute to their individual diversity and how that contributed to their past successes and failures. And so one thing we often ask our clients to do is tell me about a success you had, or how did you handle this, the last time you encountered this challenge. Don't be afraid to layer in elements of their individual diversity, but also group level diversity into that conversation. It can only give you additional insights on who they are, but also what things are important to them and how that might help in your understanding of how to guide them into a stronger path of performance in their jobs or in whatever area that you're coaching them on.
Yeah, no, I love it. Yeah, when you went back and just, and again, my interpretation as a manager, maybe Jim, yours as well, but those conversations can be so awkward and clumsy, whether it's performance or getting relationally proximate in the area where you can even start to have a conversation with integrity around the differences and how people feel about where they're the same and where they're different, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I've always appreciated just the practical application of strengths, is that it gives us an entry point into those conversations that is authentic, it is natural, it's well understood, and I think it's trusted. And to me, there's a lot of spirit about what inclusion actually represents that's so benefited by those types of conversations that we can have now. So I'm really, I as a team leader, I appreciate that opportunity, but I also appreciate the fact that you validated it for us, Ella, to know that in best practice advice and research is substantiated that way as well. Jim, any reactions or concluding thoughts from the chat room or yourself?
Yeah, one more kind of question for you, Ella. As we think about the role of a coach, right there, especially a strengths coach coming into an organization, they may have the ear of the management or of HR groups. We always tell them, be the smartest person in the room when you come in. If they were going to come in and really work on strengths, but I'll have an area to be an expert on diversity and inclusion and to be able to help those organizations see some of those things, what kind of resources or advice would you give those coaches? How would they be the smartest person in the room, be the expert, besides reading all our data and listening to this webcast, plus some of the other ones that we've done? How else would they do that, do you think?
I would, if you're going into a new organization, I would figure out what they care most about. What drives their business? What can you connect to diversity and inclusion that's important for their business outcomes? Because ultimately, we know that organizations that are doing the best in the diversity and inclusion space are the ones that have figured out how to leverage D&I for their business strategy and their desired business outcomes. At some point, the conversation around D&I being the right thing to do kind of loses some steam, especially when there's challenging economic times, right? And so let's all, have that assumption that we all do believe diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do. But what else? Why does this really matter for the organization? And so if you can be a coach or a consultant, you come in and you really connect the need for this organization, for example, to reflect its customer base, right? And having some challenges in that space, or the need for this organization to be able to connect across generations. If you can figure out either a gap or something that really is important to that organization and connect it back to their diversity and inclusion efforts and future needs, you really will be the smartest person in the room. And not only will you get the people on board who have always had a passion for D&I, but you'll also get some of those individuals that maybe this isn't their area of passion, but then they start to care as their leaders of organizations that want their organization to not only perform well, but to really thrive in a competitive landscape.
Two really great questions, I think, coming at it from the opposite side. Jess had asked this earlier in the webcast, and had asked it again. So let me just get it out there. So she says, how do you promote inclusion without excluding? For example, when you focus on a certain group that you want to include, how do you not exclude the others?
Yeah, so some organizations have done a really good job at promoting environments for allies, right? And so you might have certain employee resource groups, for example, that do highlight certain demographic groups. However, that doesn't mean they have to exclude others. I mean, I know plenty of employee resource groups that welcome and celebrate allies of that group and people outside of that particular demographic or background of experience, but want to be connected. They want to support that group's mission. And so I think that's the best way is to make it very clear that though this maybe employee resource group or another program or platform is to support this need for diversity or this need for inclusion, likely based on some current gaps, that doesn't mean that everyone can't play a part in this conversation around D&I and everyone doesn't have a role in moving the needle and making meaningful change. And so, positioning the opportunity for allies is a great way to do that.
This next question kind of assumes or is asking if we've done any research. So I'll throw that out first. Say, done any research, particularly around groups where when we think about inclusion or even diversity in specialized groups, a group, an organization that might revolve around a religious idea or might revolve around a cultural idea, where that may in itself limit some of the diversity and inclusion that goes on. Have we done any studies on that, or do you have any thoughts on that, Ella?
Yeah, I don't know that Gallup has done specific studies on that topic specifically, but I do know that we have worked with organizations that do have kind of that specific mission or specific orientation. And what they've done is often kind of partner with other organizations that may be different from them in some ways. And so whether they're partnering with them on a specific diversity and inclusion aspect or they're partnering with them on something else, it helps that, they're able to keep their same mission, but partner with other organizations that are different from them to help support inclusion and stay true to their individual missions.
Then one more comment from the chat room. It says, I think coaches are great at one of the key things that makes a huge difference to D&I conversation is just ask the person. In Ella's paper, she refers to just ask. Why don't you give us a little more on what does that mean? Just ask.
Yeah, so not to be afraid to just have authentic conversations. Just ask someone. If you don't know something, just ask them. And I've seen this so many times. There are studies out there that talk about how white male leaders, for example, really struggle with inclusion conversations because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing or they're afraid of not having the right answer. But what we know from not only our client work but from research is that many times people know when you're coming from an authentic place, and all you have to say is, "Hey, I'm asking because I don't know the answer, and I'm here to learn," or "I'm sorry I said the wrong thing, but I really want to understand. Can you help me better understand your perspective so that I can know for the future?" And kind of that sense of authenticity and humility really goes a long way with these conversations. If we all kind of understand we're here to learn from each other and grow as individuals, but also as teams, it really does go a long way in taking some of that awkwardness out of our diversity and inclusion conversations. And then it just becomes a conversation where we're getting to know each other and getting to learn more about each other.
Ella, that is super hard to do. I'll be honest. I've been in those moments and I feel like such an idiot. And I'm just like, oh, just asking kind of point me out as being that guy,
That guy that doesn't know, but now you do, right?
No, right on. It's just every inch of my body is like, okay, run away, and it's a little embarrassing sometimes when you're in those situations, but that's super great advice to think about. Just say, I think what you're saying is maybe the three hardest words. I don't know. Tell me, right?
Yeah.
Tell me what that means.
Jim, I'm so glad you just shared that because now I don't have to. But no, thank you.
I took the blow for you, Mike.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, Ella, if folks wanted to dialogue with us at Gallup here around this subject, I posted the link to one of our articles about it. But can you just what's the right way for individuals to learn more or to dialogue with us about this?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we have a ton of articles now online around diversity and inclusion, around strengths and inclusion. Our most recent article that I wrote was around how diversity and inclusion was affected recently by the college scandal, college admission scandal. And so there's so many topics that D&I plays a role in that we don't quite think about beyond just the traditional, recruiting and promotion topics that are still really important. But we're seeing D&I really infiltrate kind of all areas of life right now. And so I would say, check us out on Gallup.com, but also on Gallup.com, there is a platform on our D&I page for them to post questions or get in contact with myself or other members of our team if they'd like to have further conversations.
That's awesome. Mike, take a second and thank Ella for us.
Yeah, right. Ella, that was terrific. We had high expectations, and I just love the fluidity in a natural conversation that Strengths really does promote. I mean, we say it all the time, but we only because it's true and we believe it. Strengths is the language of D&I. Like, it really helps us become conversant in differences in the ways you described, but commonalities in the ways you described, and we can actually authentically say we are different and the same. And I think that's a really beautiful statement that we can create on purpose. So thank you for bringing the best of the application, but also the awareness around what does all of this mean, and putting us in a span of influence and control where we can do something about it. I loved it. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy our conversations and look forward to many more in the future.
Yeah, terrific.
I do as well, and we'll have you back for sure. We'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strengths Center, gallupstrengthscenter.com. Send us your questions or comments. If you can't remember any of the things we said, where to go, just send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Super easy. Coaching@gallup.com, and someone will send those back to you. You can also catch the recorded audio and video of this program, as well as all the ones that we've done on our social media sites. They're available on our coaches blog, coaching.gallup.com. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup Certified Strengths Coach or want to see any of our offerings that are available, any of our courses, and we have a ton of new ones coming out 2019, 2020, you just head over to our courses page. Really easy. We didn't make it too difficult. Courses.gallup.com. And we'd love to hear from you as well. Don't forget, the Clifton Strengths Summit is coming up. I think we're we're really, really close, maybe a month away from that happening. June 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 2019. We'd love to have you there. Still time to sign up, although it's almost full. So CliftonStrengthsSummit.com. If you want to join us, there's probably just a few hotel rooms left in town. It's going to be a busy weekend. You're going to want to join us. We'd love to see you here. I want to also ask you to join us on our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/called2coach. Love to continue the dialogue there. If you've got some questions, I'm always out there to help you answer. I don't always have the answers, but I know who does. So join us in that Facebook group. We'd appreciate it. I want to thank you for joining us today. If you joined us live, thanks for doing that as well. We'll see you back here on the next Called to Coach. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.